Compelling, on objectivity, subjectivity, the phenomenology of truth encounters, and how to change our minds. Why does one person find the case for X compelling while another finds the case against X convincing? Both believe they are rational and intelligent to assent to the case they believe in, yet both cases cannot be true. One person finds the argument that Israel is justified to use force legitimate, while another finds the argument conservative propaganda. One person finds the case that Robert E. Lee was a hero grotesque and absurd, while another person finds the argument nuanced and conceivable. One person finds it believable that Roosevelt knew about Pearl Harbor ahead of time, while another finds the argument a silly conspiracy. Why does one person find X believable but not anti-X, or why? Clearly, it is because one person is convinced by one case and not the other, but the question is why? Why is a person compelled and convinced by X? What occurs in the act of a person being compelled and convinced? And why does what occurs in the act occur at all? Section 1. When I read an argument against the war in Iraq, for example, I never read it not being me. Inside of me, I carry every experience, conversation, thought, conviction, and the like that I've ever had, at least subconsciously. I cannot read the argument not being this summation, and likewise I cannot read it without experiencing the feelings, associations, thoughts, and the like that this summation will cause me to have. I don't will to feel agreement and or good when reading the argument. It just happens, as the opposite might just as well occur. Though I will to read the argument, I don't necessarily will to feel and experience all I feel and experience while reading the argument. Perhaps I will to experience the thoughts, conversations, and so on that contributed to me being the summation that feels and experiences what I do while reading the argument, but I don't necessarily will to feel and experience what I do now in the act of reading. I just feel and experience what I feel and experience. And since these aren't a result so much of conscious choice, these feelings and experiences are prone to strike us as coming from the argument, not from us. Hence, if we feel bad, we are prone to think the argument is bad. If we feel good, we are prone to think the argument is good. In other words, we are prone to judge the quality of an argument based on how we feel about it, even though if we felt bad about 2 + 2 = 4, it wouldn't be any more or less true. But here's the key. We don't do this in such a way that we realize we are judging the quality of an argument based on how we feel about it. Rather, we objectively believe we are judging the argument on rational and intellectual grounds. We believe we are objectively judging it, not subjectively, though, of course, there is no subjective and objectivity, ultimately just subjective/objective, as discussed in the Heart and Mind Dialectic and the Phenomenology of Argument by O.G. Rose. After this judging occurs, considering the thoughts presented in Self-Delusion, the Towardness of Evidence, and the Paradox of Judgment by O.G. Rose, it is very difficult to go back. This brings us to a problem. How can we tell when we are judging an argument as false based on feelings versus based on intellect? Seeing as the heart and the mind aren't split, we feel and intellectualize simultaneously. The two are always blurred. We can't only feel or think about an argument against the war in Iraq. We can only think. How can we draw the line then? How can we tell when we are convinced by an argument on the right grounds? How can we tell when we are under our subjectivity that is dressed in objectivity? How can we tell when we are convinced and compelled for the right reasons? There are no easy answers to these questions, and we can never be entirely free of the existential uncertainty that comes with being a thinking human in an age when objectivity, as a thing in itself, is cherished, yet subjectivity/objectivity inescapable. The challenge is especially great if the map is indestructible, but that must be discussed at another time. Section 2. We cannot be compelled or convinced without a self. Rocks aren't moved by arguments. If we had no self, we would have no worldview, and so lack a framework in which an argument could fit. We'd lack a world to attract a view toward, per se. As if magnets attracted by identical charges versus opposites, so a conservative attracts and is attracted to conservative arguments while being repelled and repelling liberal arguments. If there was no magnet, no self, there would be no attracting or repelling. Nothing would happen. Arguments would not exist if people didn't exist. Rocks don't argue. Without the self and subjective arguments we try to get around and get under to critique objectivity, in order to critique objectively, arguments wouldn't exist. Likewise, if selves didn't exist, arguments wouldn't be able to compel or convince for there would be nothing to compel or convince, nor would there be anything that could experience the argument as more than unintelligible marks or sounds. Without the self, there wouldn't be intellect, and so there wouldn't be the capacity to comprehend arguments. The self makes possible the intellect, and yet also begets the subjectivity, which the intellect ironically strives to transcend. What tries to solve the problem and the problem itself share the same source. The desire to be objective emerges from the self, which begets the subjectivity that we desire to be objective against. To erase subjectivity, we would have to erase the self which makes possible the intellect, and for the sake of the intellect, we desire objectivity. We desire to be subjective and objective, but we are inescapably subjective/objective beings, torn apart by our splitting desire. Section 3. When I read an argument against the war in Iraq, if I'm intellectually honest, I want to be objective and examine the argument on its own terms. But problematically, the very reason I'm reading the argument is because something in me was attracted to this article versus an article about why New York is the worst city. For example, it is thanks to subjectivity that I pick X to want to be objective about versus Y. Without subjectivity, I'd lack any sorting mechanism and end up either focusing on nothing or overwhelmed. Furthermore, in the act of reading the article, certain sentences are going to stand out to me as good or bad. Why? It's because of my you. It moves sentences like a magnet. If I was so objective that I was an object, sentences would stay in place, per se. And yet when I read the article, there is a sense that I want to be an object. I want my subjectivity to completely move aside. And yet if I was an object, I wouldn't have any self that could be convinced of anything or to even desire to be an object. Irony, paradox, inescapable. Trying to be objective by denying the presence of subjectivity isn't as fruitful as trying to be objective while accepting not our subjectivity so much as our objectivity/subjectivity. It is imperative that we not forget that subjectivity isn't a simile for wrong. Just because we subjectively believe that X is true doesn't mean that X is false. This is a common mistake, but admittedly it's very hard to write about subjectivity without implying this notion. Subjective doesn't mean wrong, but rather the possibility of being wrong and or right. For without subjectivity, there is no you to be either. Rocks can't be right or wrong. Yet, at the same time, objective doesn't necessarily mean right. I can be objective about the war in Iraq relative to the information available to me and yet still be wrong. The conflation of subjective and wrong and objective with right has been costly. Both subjectivity and objectivity imply the possibility of being right and or wrong. For there is no such thing as subjective and objective separately, only subjective/objective as one. Technically speaking, we cannot be objective or subjective, only subjective/objective. Yes, perhaps we can, in one instance, be more so objective than subjective and vice versa. And yes, there is truth to the notion that when trying to decide if we are for or against something, we should be more so objective than subjective. But if we want to be only objective, we want what is impossible. And in fact, this very want may lead us into deceiving ourselves into thinking we are objective when we aren't. If we are so self-deceived, though, this won't necessarily mean we are wrong, but it will increase the probability that we will think we are more right than we actually are, especially if we conflate objective and right with right. Additionally, we will be more likely to think of those who disagree with us as subjective and or wrong, which will contribute to self-deception and the probability of being not only wrong but unwilling to change views, even if our view is wrong. Can an object be right about the war in Iraq? No, and yet an object is the most objective of things. It is actually objective alone, not subjective and objective, or even subjective/subjective. Strangely, in wanting to be objective about the war in Iraq, there is a sense in which we want to be that which can't have a right or wrong view about the war in Iraq at all. The desire is paradoxical, and yet there is validity to the degree. We should want to be objective, even though we technically can't be. This is because we as humans seem more prone to be subjective than objective. We're fundamentally selves, after all, though we are always to some degree both, and this desire helps us achieve a better equilibrium, though that isn't to say there are no situations in which one should be more subjective than objective or objective than subjective. Though we can't be objective alone, wanting to be what we can't be helps us be better intellectual beings. Though we fail at what we attempt, the attempt makes us fail more successfully. But we do fail. And acknowledging this perhaps will help us live together, for it will give us something humbling that we all have in common. Subjectivity is intellectual and objectivity emotional, but accepting this forces us to deconstruct a myth that helps us believe that we aren't the paradoxical beings that we necessarily cannot avoid being. So what does the phrase be objective mean? To start, it means to be a being capable of being right and or wrong, as does being subjective. Yet, because objectivity/subjectivity is inseparable, if someone says be objective, it must mean be more so objective than objective. The phrase must be about emphasis for the sake of restoring the balance already discussed. And there is validity to this, certainly, but there is a difference between telling humans to be objective who think subjectively and objectively are separable versus those who assent to the reality that humans are inescapably both. For the latter will understand that being objective isn't about erasing subjectivity, but crafting it, like a porter into a means for understanding the world in its fullness. After all, a world without subjectivity is a world without beauty, truth, and goodness, so to embrace subjectivity is to embrace a dimension which colors life, making it worth living. But those who believe in the myth that subjectivity and objectivity are divisible will take the phrase be objective to mean transcend the subjectivity that makes life worth living. Transcend that which makes you attracted to anything at all. This pervasive misunderstanding is not only unhelpful, but a threat to human flourishing and happiness. Before moving on, please don't take me to be saying that we can never use the word subjective and objective to mean what we usually take them as meaning. I certainly have used them as such. My point in this work is to emphasize technicalities and the importance of remembering those technicalities as we use the words as we usually use them. Again, to put what this paper has said another way, when we talk about objectivity, we're mostly talking about perspective. When we say you are objective, we say you have a clear perspective more so than you are right. Likewise, when we say you are subjective, we say you have a cloudy perspective more so than you are wrong. Considering this, both objectivity and subjectivity belong in the same bar of perspective, with objective being on one end represented by black, perhaps, and subjective at the other end represented by white. And there's a graph in the paper. As we move from one end of the gradient, the colors blend into one another. At the middle, an individual is half objective and half subjective. No one ever achieves, overall at least, complete objectivity or complete subjectivity. We all fall somewhere along the gradient. At one moment, perhaps we're 70% objective and 70% objective and 30% subjective. At another, 42 objective and 58 subjective, and so on. No one can say for sure about themselves or anyone else what percentage of what they are at a given moment, but regardless of the breakdown in nature of the person's perspective, the individual won't necessarily be either right or wrong. Someone who is completely objective can still be wrong, as someone who is completely subjective can be right. Especially as we use the words as we usually use them, it is imperative to realize that both subjectivity and objectivity are two sides of the same coin of perspective. Both are ways of seeing. If we didn't have subjectivity, we also wouldn't have objectivity, for the only way to be free of subjectivity is to not have eyes. In other words, our vision is always both cloudy and clear, but just because our vision is cloudy doesn't mean it can't identify, and someone with clear vision doesn't always correctly identify what he or she clearly sees. And clouds aren't inherently bad. Without them, there wouldn't be rain, and without rain, the world dries up and perishes under the clear skies and the relentless beating of the sun. A world without clouds and rain would be colorless and dead, as would be a world without subjectivity. Section 4. Arguably a digression, though digression isn't necessarily a simile with unproductive, we now come to the matter of certainty-uncertainty, which is very similar to the matter of objectivity-subjectivity. The matter of convincing and compelling is notably interesting when considered in light of the short story Ludwig by O.G. Rose, deeply inspired by Uncertainty by Ludwig Wittgenstein. Whereas the story makes clear we have certainty over very little, and yet we are still compelled and convinced. Few have actually been to Iraq and know for sure that the war there is a fiasco. We rely on the authority of the media to inform us about world events. Few have actually done the math themselves to verify M-theory. We rely on the authority of experts. Few have studied actual documents from the Civil War era to determine for sure what the war was about. We understand this war as historians have taught us to understand it. And this isn't to say the war in Iraq isn't a fiasco, that M-theory isn't true, or that historians misrepresent history, but rather to point out that we don't actually know for sure much of what we believe we know for sure. And yet, in no way whatsoever does this seem to impede our capacity to be convinced or compelled. How can we be convinced and compelled by that which we cannot be certain about? To be uncertain about X is precisely not to be convinced by X, and yet we seem to be convinced readily that a tree is a tree, the cause of the Civil War was states' rights, Pluto exists, my friend is honest, and so on. How? There seems to be a point where we are certain enough that we can be convinced and compelled, even though we can't be compelled completely certain. This brings us to another gradient. And there's a graph in the paper. We never seem completely certain or uncertain. We seem ultimately always uncertain, with the UN in parentheses, as we are always subjective/objective. We are in one moment 80% certain and 20% uncertain. Another moment 30% certain and 70% uncertain, and so on. There always seems to be space for us to be wrong, and realizing this is healthy for pluralism. Objective and certain have very similar meanings, as do objective and subjective and uncertain. They seem to follow one another. What we are objective about is that which we seem to be certain about, subjective, uncertain about. And as it is not the case that what we are objective/subjective about is that which we are necessarily right or wrong about, so it is the case regarding what we are certain/uncertain about. I can be utterly certain about something that is false, as I can be utterly uncertain about what is true. But still, how can I be compelled by that which I hold uncertainty about? For one, we don't actually feel uncertain about much of what we are actually uncertain about without realizing it. I'm not actually certain that the Roman Empire existed. I haven't studied the evidence myself, but I feel certain that it existed, because I wrongly trust the expert, and hence can be compelled by evidence about it. Second, I am truly ignorant about my actual uncertainty. I don't know that I don't know if Rome existed. My trust in experts is so great that the fact I haven't studied the evidence myself becomes invisible to me, and the thought Rome didn't exist, absurd. The thought that we don't actually know for ourselves much of what we are told rises and falls in consciousness, if it ever rises at all, and we become truly ignorant about how much in the world we are actually uncertain about. And when I am truly ignorant of my uncertainty about X, I paradoxically feel certain about X, making it possible for me to be compelled and convinced by X. What I am compelled by isn't that which is necessarily true, but it must necessarily be that which I feel is true. I am why I can be convinced and compelled by that which I am actually uncertain about, for I am the source of my feelings and my true ignorance. I can bridge a gap in myself that I don't bridge at all, and do so in a way that makes me genuinely believe that I've actually bridged the gap. More often than not, when I am convinced by X instead of Y, I'm relying on authority that I cannot hold actual certainty about, and yet I'm reliant in such a way that I hide from myself the very fact that I'm relying on uncertain authority. I project onto X my idea of X, and then I am attracted to X like a magnet because of something within me, something out of which my idea of X very well may have been crafted. In a sense, I attract myself, and if I am attracted, compelled by X instead of Y, it is probably because X makes more invitational room for me than does Y, perhaps because Y confronts my true ignorance in ways that feel bad and uncomfortable. X is more like me than is Y, but that doesn't necessarily mean that X is false and Y true. Rather, it could mean only that I am prone to self-deceive myself in a manner that helps me feel objective and clear-sighted. Ironically, we strive to be certain to avoid the self-deception we are all prone to, and yet certainty itself is prone to being a worse kind of self-deception, precisely because we believe it is freedom from self-deception. We run from self-deception into blindness of blindness. But what is certainty then, if not rightness? It's just a feeling, one prone to utterly self-deceive, and yet one that is vital for us and the main drive of human action, as will be explored in The True Isn't the Rational by O.G. Rose. Section 5. This all brings us to a question that we have in some respects answered, but that needs more elaboration. Is objectivity in any capacity possible, or is it always just escaping us? Answer, it depends. With A is A by O.G. Rose in mind, let me explain. What can I be objective about? 2 plus 2 equals 4? Yes, no. Math doesn't exist in the world, yet exists objectively to humans. The number 2 cannot be found walking on the sidewalk. It is created in the human mind and projected into the world from there. The source of math is in fact the human being, and it exists because subjectivity exists. Does that mean math isn't objective? Yes, no. It means math is subjective, but leans toward objectivity, per se. Relative to humans, math is indeed more so objective, but math isn't such relative to the whole of being. So in one way, I can be objective about math, but in another, I cannot be. Can I be objective about the historical fact that the Constitution was signed September 17, 1787? Yes, no. Relative to humans, a certain piece of paper is the Constitution, but relative to the world, the Constitution isn't real, only a piece of paper. In fact, there isn't even paper, just atoms, but not the word atoms. And without humans, there would be no topic of history, and so no historical facts. In fact, it is perhaps the case that there wouldn't even be facts. Yes, there would be actualities, but no beings for these actualities to be toward, and hence known as facts. And so historical facts are subjective/objective too, though lean toward objectivity. I could go on. My point is that at best humans can achieve a objectivity that leans toward objectivity. Though remember, objective isn't a simile with true/right. Though that doesn't mean what is objective isn't true/right. And if this is what is meant by objective, there is validity to the word. But if objective doesn't necessarily mean right, what is the use of the word? It would seem that what is objective is that which has a higher than normal probability of being right, but not necessarily. But if that's all the word means, is the word worth using, seeing how prone the term is to causing misunderstanding? Perhaps not. To conclude, reminiscent of Vico, humans can only achieve meaningful objectivity about that which is created by and relative to humans, such as math, historical facts, identity, so on, even though such entities are beget by and out of subjectivity/objectivity, human selves. Hence, it is possible to be objective relative to something, though not objective overall, and considering this, it is a valid endeavor to try to be objective relative to this or that, but it should never be forgotten that none of us are capable of true objectivity overall, for this contributes to a humility that is necessary in our pluralistic age, an age which I believe requires success of the Habermasian project to continue. Furthermore, like the realization that true ignorance exists, never forgetting our state of subjectivity/objectivity can contribute to a healthy existential tension in each of us that will help us constantly re-examine what we think and the very experiences we undergo of arguments, discussions, debates, and the like. What is hard can also be good. Section 6. Relative objectivity being possible, how do we achieve it? Not easily. Again, many papers by Rose are dedicated to the question of how to function well as an intellectual being. But do remember that objective not being a simile of right, it is possible for us to achieve the difficult to gain objectivity and still be wrong. And the existential tension that we might be wrong will always be present. Exercising perfectly the art of thinking doesn't guarantee being correct relative to this or that, though it does mean that there will be a higher probability of such. Nothing is guaranteed, and only nothing, especially if the map is indestructible. We will always have to live with wondering if we are wrong, and yet this can be healthy. Fair enough, but assuming we follow these lessons and achieve objectivity best we can, how will we know when we encounter actual truth? How will we know when we are being compelled and convinced by that which is actually true versus that which we only think is true? We will never be able to know for sure. Existential uncertainty is unavoidable to some degree, though it is possible to achieve states of less versus more. But if we are to have some degree of existential stability on the matter, we must first recognize that we are looking for a kind of experience of truth more so than a simple intellectual assent. Math is encountered through an experience, not simply thought. A historical fact is encountered in a classroom while thinking about practice and worried about what our peers said about us earlier. Facts are always experienced, not simply contemplated. This is a reason why everything is always subjective/objective, because experience itself is necessarily a mixture of the objects and subjects. To humans, there is no such thing as an object that isn't experienced or an experience that doesn't consist of objects. Keep in mind that a living thing is both a subject and an object. Sarah is her body and self, for example. Hence, if we are going to discuss how to recognize actual truth, we must discuss what it's like to experience truth, while not forgetting there will always be some degree of uncertainty. This brings us to the phenomenology of truth encounters. What is it like to encounter actual truth? It's very much like encountering our truth, a truth that is only true relative to us, and perhaps exactly the same. Are there experiential characteristics that separate a relative to truth from an actual truth? In other words, what is different about an experience of a truth to me from an experience of a truth that is actually true? First, realize that the experiences can be similar, for what is true to me can in fact be actually true. It's actually easier to tell the difference when the two conflict than when they synthesize, and in that way, ironically, the existential tension over am I right can actually be worse when what I think is true is in fact actually true. Second, considering the death of skepticism and on critical thinking, both by O.G. Rose, a feeling of existential anxiety can be a sign that we are encountering that which doesn't simply reinforce our worldview, but forces us to re-examine it. If what we are encountering has existential consequences, this can be a sign of encountering actual truth, but not necessarily. If a Christian encounters a strong argument for atheism that causes the Christian to feel anxiety, this doesn't necessarily mean the Christian is encountering truth, but it may. This phenomenological matter is a difficult one to settle. What are the features of something that clicks, of a line that jumps out from a book, a point made by a person during a lecture that stands out, a thought that we can't forget? What are the characteristics of these things that strike us as true? Are they simply a reflection of bias and ideology, or is it that what clicks is that which is actually true? It's hard to say, getting under a truth, for the truth is an incredible challenge, but what might be helpful is a list of characteristics of something that clicks. Consider the following. 1. Transferability. The truth in question isn't limited to one area, but rather it can be applied to many areas. The world isn't segmented but holistic. Humans split the world apart in thought in ways that the world is never actually split in of itself. Hence, a truth that only appears to one of the slices is a truth that is more likely to be something created by the human mind versus something that is actually in the world. Just because something is made in the mind doesn't mean it's fake, but if a truth is transferable, there is at least a higher likelihood that it isn't only a mental apparition. 2. Practicality. The truth demands something of us, and there is a strong sign it is actually true when it forces us outside our comfort zone. It forces us to do something and impacts how we practice in the world. The idea has some kind of impact on our world, which is evidence that the idea isn't simply reinforcing how we want to live. Just because an idea will impact how we live in the world doesn't mean it is necessarily true, but is a good sign. 3. Non-hierarchy. All hierarchies are made by humans. Nature does not think of a creature that survives over others as better. What occurs is simply what occurs. Whenever a person uses a word like better, faster, and the like, a hierarchy is created, which instantly necessitates the presence of a human with a subjectivity that ranks this as that and that as this. Hence, a truth that implies a hierarchy automatically necessitates the presence of a human subjectivity, which implies the possibility of a confusion of an idea of truth with actual truth. Additionally, a hierarchy implies a splitting up of the world, of being into beings, and relative to the world is never so split up. Its parts are always working in concert. Yes, technically there is no such thing as the world, just as each of its individual parts all referenced to at once with the word world, but it is the case that those individual parts always operate within a network that they never exist outside of, and yet hierarchy implies it can. A truth that doesn't imply a hierarchy has a higher likelihood of being actually true, but I don't mean to imply all truths that imply hierarchy are necessarily false. It depends. Non-moralizing and or non-valuation. An ethic necessitates a human presence. There is no murder in nature, only killing. A truth that establishes X is wrong/right is a truth that necessitates an observer who holds a set of values relative to which X is wrong or right. Relative to another observer, a different set of values and morals could be present. Murder cannot exist as distinct from killing without values like human life is irreplaceable. Theft cannot exist without a value of private property, and so on. A truth that doesn't moralize or evaluate is just a truth that has a higher likelihood of being actually true, but this doesn't mean murder isn't wrong. Values and moralities don't make a truth false, but they are a sign that relativity is involved, warranting skepticism, which isn't a simile for disbelief. Please note, though, that we might be more equipped to identify subjective truths than ultimate truths, assuming Vitko is correct. Number 5, explanation and justified premises. A case which is justified by its premises and held up by an explanation which is grounded in those premises is a truth that has a higher likelihood of being actually true. However, identifying what constitutes justified premises and a justified explanation is no easy matter, seeing as we are locked in ourselves, and what is justified to us may not be actually justified. How can we tell? Many of the essays by Rose hope to offer some tools. This is a short list, and at the end of the day, isn't it possible that all these phenomenological characteristics are only of what I think is true versus is what is true? Perhaps. And if it were the case that I were to encounter my truth versus the truth, I very well might not know that I don't know that I'm encountering my truth versus the truth. True ignorance is a constant threat to being actual. However, this is always the case, but at least by knowing the characteristics of something that clicks, along with the ideas and advice offered in other works by Rose, there is at least a better chance of achieving actuality. But then again, perhaps not. How can we say for sure? Section 7. Is it possible to compel and convince anyone who isn't already compelled and convinced? Perhaps by presenting truths with the characteristics listed above? Perhaps, but if the map is indestructible, as will be discussed in other works, it would not seem possible. But surely people have changed their minds in history. Convincing can't be impossible. But how does it happen? What in a person makes it possible for the person to be convinced and compelled away from his or her worldview into another? Admittedly, it seems incredibly difficult, especially if we're speaking for non-emotional reasons. Before addressing these questions, it's helpful to ask why a person participates in the worldview a given person participates in. It seems to be the case that the worldview a person starts with isn't something the person is convinced into, but more so born into. A person without a worldview can't really be convinced of anything, for there is no standard against which a person can be convinced of this or that, nor any worldview from which the person can be convinced into another. One's starting worldview, per se, isn't one a person acquires via convincing, but more so absorbing. And yet we all experience our starting worldview as if we acquired it rationally through skepticism, weighing the evidence, and so on. This doesn't mean our starting worldview is necessarily false, but it does mean we are prone to overestimate our own intellectualism. Hence, the matter of being convinced isn't a matter of why people adopt the starting worldview they do, but a question of how to convince a person from that starting point to something else, though it's possible for a person to be convinced in the name of truth from truth to falsity. Considering the magnet metaphor from earlier, there has to be something in a person to attract that person from X to Y, at the very least rationally. At the very least rationality, I mean. And what seems to be most in a person is their starting worldview, which is a matter of not simply abstract frameworks, but experiences, emotions, and so on. Hence, to convince someone from X, Y must have some image or characteristics of X. Otherwise, the person being convinced can't be attracted from X to Y, or at least it is incredibly difficult. Therefore, it is at least somewhat possible to compel and convince someone who isn't already compelled and convinced by his or herself, but only if Y is presented in a way that brings out its likeness to X. If X has no connection with Y, to try to convince someone to X is like trying to convince someone in English to convert from atheism to Christianity who only speaks Chinese. It's possible, yet not really. But if there must be something like X and Y, doesn't this mean that in some way we can never fully escape our starting worldview, since we can only be convinced into that which is like it, in a sense? But just because a Y is like X doesn't mean it is less true or more true. Likeness has no direct relation with validity. And it doesn't seem fated that we all be stuck to some degree in our starting worldview, but it doesn't seem probable that a given person never truly escapes. Though again, this doesn't mean a given individual is necessarily wrong. At best, it seems as long as they are linked by the bridges of likeness, a person can move from X to Y, then Y to Z, and then Z to B, with B being not very like X directly, though like X through Y and Z. It seems probable that we never really move but so far from our starting worldview, whether it be true or false. If we are compelled into another framework, it is probable that framework be like the framework we absorbed. But at the end of the day, it is likely we will maintain our starting worldview, a framework we weren't convinced into but started with to even make possible being convinced, though it is unlikely we will ever be, though that isn't to say our worldview is unlikely to change in degree versus kind. Living out what we start with, we experience our framework as one we are convinced by, when really it is more so one we absorbed, and go through life probably never actually being convinced of anything at all. That changes our framework in kind versus in degree, at least. Do note that this means when we try to convince someone to change their view, we are likely asking them to achieve rational grounding for something we ourselves probably just absorbed, and then saw evidence for. In other words, we are likely demanding a standard to be met that we ourselves didn't meet, and yet we likely believe we met that standard. Additionally, being convinced is an unnatural process. It is natural to absorb and unnatural to conclude, per se. So we ask ourselves through argument to undergo something unnatural that we ourselves probably didn't undergo, and then we get frustrated when they resist. Also note that absorbing is how we can hold worldviews despite the formidable epistemological challenges that come with assenting to a view. It is probable that we live in a state unconvinced of our worldview, for we just absorbed it, and that gradually our worldview becomes invisible to us, like a doorknob that works, to borrow from Heidegger. As we live out our lives and just try to make it through this hard life in one piece, in a way, we forget we are Christian and atheist, like air and so forth, like air, it covers everything. It's through what we see all and that which sustains us. Until we travel to outer space, where air is gone, which few will ever do, we never think about the presence of air. Likewise, the Christianity of the Christian is invisible until the Christian encounters the atheist and vice versa. Ideology is real and necessary, as is air, and yet exists as a present absence until something threatens it. Is all this a problem? Perhaps, perhaps not. It is reality. It would seem that we cannot so much convince other people to change from X to Y so much as people must convince themselves, and we at best can present a given individual with evidence that Y is like X, which the individual must choose to acknowledge on his or her own. Simply put, it seems we can present others with water but not force them to drink. We can present others with fire but not force them to burn. But what if we only think we are presenting a person with living water and not deadly fire, truth instead of falsity? Then the person shouldn't accept what we offer, and it is up to that individual to have cultivated the life of the mind within his or herself to have the necessary discernment. We all have responsibilities. Okay, but what if people are born ascribing to an apocalyptic ideology, an ideology that if they aren't convinced out of, the world will end? What if a situation arose in which failure to convince was failure to save humanity? If it was necessary to stop the apocalypse to move X to C, how could this be done without resorting to violence? Well, aware that it is unlikely a person be convinced from X to Y unless X is like Y, we are at least equipped with a guide for what we need to do, if there is to be any hope at all. If we realize Y must be like X, we know we must look for what in my view is like another view versus what in their view is wrong, and or how do I get them to realize they are wrong. In a sense, to be convinced to move from X to Y necessarily entails admitting I was wrong. But it's not the same as throwing out our entire worldview versus only changing it by degrees, perhaps from out of being apocalyptic. Being wrong and adapting aren't the same thing existentially or philosophically. To find what an X is like Y, we must be empathetic. We must try to see the world through the eyes of those who assent to Y. Hence, convincing takes empathy, and in the act of convincing, one also has to convince his or herself of what he or she is preaching. This is because empathizing entails seeing oneself through the eyes of another. In fact, that might be the first thing we see through different eyes. Hence, empathy entails seeing what is most familiar as strange, and to see oneself as strange is startling and even overwhelming. It's like returning home after many years and finding home tainted and mutated with apartment complexes. The existential uncertainty caused by pain is a reason many don't empathize, but it is necessary for convincing. To the degree a person engaged in trying to convince another is to the degree the person will fail to find the like which the person who believes in X needs to transition to Y. Common ground isn't simply needed for political correctness or bipartisanship, but for the possibility of an argument changing a person's mind at all. People cannot convince without also convincing themselves. This is why few of us ever try to convince anyone of anything. We let others live their lives because we don't want to threaten our way of life. Leaving others alone is often to be left alone. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing, unless that is an apocalyptic worldview forces us to attempt convincing and compelling others from X to Y. In this situation, self-preservation is self-destruction. But even if in this situation we don't cave into the temptation of self-preservation and engage in empathy, convincing individuals away from an apocalyptic worldview isn't simply a matter of presenting them with a likeness bridge they can choose to use or not to use. And note here that even if we present an incredible case for Y over X, there is no guarantee people will change out of their apocalyptic worldview. Not only must people be convinced, but they also must be given the tools necessary for being convinced. In other words, they must be able to think and intellectualize well. Seeing as no one thinks they can't do these things well, we first have to convince others that they are truly ignorant about their lack of capacity to conceptualize, which might also be our problem. And that will only occur if we can make people realize for themselves that they are truly ignorant. We cannot force anyone to believe this. And even if we succeed at this, we then need them to recognize the need for the tools necessary for thinking well, and this is all before we can even begin moving the individual from apocalyptic worldview X to Y. And if a person ascribes to such an apocalyptic worldview, it is very possible that the individual will be difficult to speak to, let alone convince to move his or herself into accepting true ignorance, the need for tools of thinking, and worldview Y. And keep in mind that as a person probably requires a likeness bridge between ideologies to shift, so a person must see something like X in the argument itself that the person is truly ignorant and needs conceptual tools. For otherwise, the person probably won't be moved to confront his or her true ignorance or lack of conceptual tools. And don't forget, even if we succeed at compelling a person to grasp the need to think and confront true ignorance, let alone why, we cannot make the person accept why. Not only, no one can make anyone accept anything, even that which will save the world. Clearly, the challenge is great. It is hard to empathize with those who hold an apocalyptic worldview precisely because their view is apocalyptic, and yet it is with those who empathy is most necessary. Empathizing with such people feels like accepting their worldview, which our desire to stop the apocalypse will not readily allow us to do. And do note that we tend to think of those who disagree with us as contributing to the destruction of the world in some way. Furthermore, to empathize requires becoming existentially uncertain with our own self, which is hard to bring ourselves to do in a world where living without such existential reflection allows us to live our practical lives happily and well. But if an apocalyptic worldview formulates, the only way to stop it is to become uncomfortable with ourselves. But what if the map is indestructible? Then won't we make ourselves uncomfortable for nothing? For more about O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter. All likes and follows are appreciated, and thank you for your time.